Hello, welcome to Crash Course. I will be talking about the French and Indian War, the First and Second Continental Congress meetings. French and Indian War, it lasted between 1754 and 1763. Prior to this, the natives, or as they were known, Indians, were being more hostile towards the French, British, and overall everyone, because their land was constantly being taken away. As well as this, just a few years prior, there was the King George War, which, as again, caused more conflict. Excuse me, sorry. Description of the French after the French and Indian War was the French lost trade routes and more land, they lost land. And the British, they went into further debt because they helped their colonies, the 13 original, I can't name them because... but the colonists, however, they prospered from it. They didn't really need to fight, but they did. They did fight. They learned how to become one as a unit to fight against a common enemy. And they also gained trade routes because the French had lost them and the British gave it to them so they could get more trade for the British. It's just they're trying to work together. So with that, they also lost the ability to move westward, because that's where the natives had ran off to after the French and Indian War, and the British didn't want to have another French and Indian War, or more Indian War, because I'm pretty sure the French were more off and to the side. Some key people were George Washington, who was a key defender for the British, and their settlements. He would keep up morale for his men, and which would keep them fighting longer, because the conditions they were terrible. They still had to wait for the British to get there to fight with them, so they had to hold them off. And some impacts that were caused were economically. After the war, again, multiple acts and taxes were placed on by the British in order to gain back to get them out of the debt. Because, as it said, them going into war with the French and the Indians, that put them into further debt, which they were already in. Social impact. Because of this war, the colonists, once again, as I said, they were able to work together against a common enemy, and this would play later when... I almost said Civil War. That's a completely different topic, which we might get to in the future. Depends. No, it was the... I keep on wanting to say Civil. American Revolution. Because of this, because they worked together to fight against a common enemy, this would come together in the future when when the American Revolution would start. Politically, because the British were more active after the war, they had more control over colonists and what they paid for and how much. This would lead to riots and boycotting products, and ultimately the American Revolution. Next is the First Continental Congress. This took place between the years of 1774 and 1775. took place during September, but its impact was the sole reason for everything. And some causes prior to this was King George has set in motion the Intolerable Acts, which in Boston was under harsh martial law, and the meeting was held to state they condone any force protesters they condone any force protesters did upon British troops, because if they were able to peacefully protest, but they were then applied force by the British troops, they should have the right to fight back against tyrannical rule or something that would seem similar to them. I'm trying to remember. Oh, yeah. Afterwards, because of this, the Minutemen, a civilian troops, were stockpiling weapons for the possibility of British troops attacking. They did not do it in order to attack British. They did it to protect themselves. But this wasn't seen as that from King George. So, some people who attended the first meeting was John Adams, George Washington, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry. They were all involved in the First Continental Congress and would debate over what their plans of action against British troops would be. The impact, both economically, social, and political, where all the colonies agreed to boycott British goods, which made it difficult for British to get out of debt again. Because the First Continental Congress, that's a little tongue twister, supported fighting back against British troops, the people came to readying themselves against any unnecessary violence the British troops brought upon them. That was the Minutemen. Politically, this is the point where the colonies were trying to leave the British for good and set out on their own. And in doing so, they would need to set up a new government. They started planting seeds for this after the American Revolutionary War, but they are not there yet. This affected the American Revolution because it gave the people the mindset that they could fight back if needed to. Fight back against any tyranny that tried to take their rights that Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and all those names I mentioned earlier said that they had, that they made the vision that they had it, even though it was never written down by this point in a document. The Continental Congress number 2. May and June of 1775, just a year after the Second Continental Congress. I think it was. Hold on. Let me make sure I'm not being a little stupid here. No, I'm being a little stupid here. Forgive me. It was not even a year. They met up a few months later. Prior to this was the Lexington and Concord had just happened. These were two of the first fights of the American Revolution. Lexington was I'm pretty sure it could be reversed. I'm pretty sure Lexington was one of the first battles, and it was only 15 minutes. Many colonists had died because they were not prepared, but for Concord, they did one of the first signs of guerrilla warfare that they learned from the Indians. And they were able to fight back against the British troops in Concord. Afterwards, the army had been named, and they had a general, George Washington. They also decided to print money for troops and make a community to deal with other nations. Committee, sorry. Key people, once again, were George Washington, James Adams, Samuel Adams, and Patrick Henry. Economically, now that they printed money, it caused some future inflation, but it didn't happen right away. Social impact, now that they had a proper general, their morale for the civilian troops, Minutemen, they skyrocketed. A rocket wasn't invented then, but just let the phrase stay. And because of this, they looked up to George Washington, and this would be the main reason why he would be seen as the first president in the future. That was the political. I kind of merged social and political together. Quirky, different. So yes, that is my topic. For this crash course, these three: First Indian War, and the First and Second Continental Congress. To summarize it up, French Indian War. After fighting, the natives were sent off. French lost land, territory, everything, mostly. British, they went into further debt. Colonists, they lost the ability to go westward, which kind of pissed them off. Excuse me. They also got trade routes and more territory that the French had. In the First Continental Congress, this was basically setting seeds for the fights that would come. Second one was basically setting up the future government. So, thank you for watching, and I'll see you Monday.